The forest of Beth-aven is thick with the dust of fleeing chariots and the sweat of a running battle. The Philistine garrison has finally broken. Israel is hunting them through the rocks and the ravines, pushing the enemy back toward Aijalon. But look closely at the men doing the hunting. They are hollowed out, trembling. They pass right by food on the forest floor, their eyes downcast, their mouths completely shut. 1 Samuel chapter 14 verse 24 names the unnatural condition of this army. And the men of Israel were distressed that day. For Saul had adjured the people, saying, "Cursed be the man that eateth any food until evening, that I may be avenged on mine enemies." So none of the people tasted any food. Stop right there. A king's ego, spoken in the early morning dark, has sealed the lips of an entire army. He has tied their survival to his personal vengeance. But one man was not in the camp to hear it. The very man who started the rout. Jonathan, he walks into the woods, completely unaware of the spiritual snare his father has laid across the trees. Picture it. A forest literally weeping with sustenance. Verse 25 says, "And all they of the land came to a wood, and there was honey upon the ground. The earth is sticky with it. Yet thousands of armed men march right over it, their stomachs cramping, their vision blurring. Not one man breaks rank, not one man stoops to eat, except the prince." Jonathan reaches out with the wooden staff in his hand. He dips the tip of the rod into a honeycomb, brings it to his mouth, and tastes it. He did not speak the vow. He did not hear the vow. But in the unseen realm, a mechanism has just snapped shut. How did a single drop of wild honey activate an ancient, lethal spiritual tripwire, forcing the sacred stones of Israel to hunt down a king's son in the dark? To understand the sheer danger of what Jonathan just did, we have to look outside the English translation. We need to consult the Targum Jonathan, the ancient Aramaic paraphrase of the Hebrew text read in the early synagogues. The Targum does not describe Saul's command as a simple military order or a fasting decree. It uses language of total spiritual excommunication. It says Saul bound the camp with an anathema, a death weight. Read that again. Saul did not just give an order, he wove a curse into the fabric of the camp, and Jonathan's staff has just pierced it. The wood is dripping with golden honey. The moment it touches his lips, the text says, his eyes are enlightened. The physical world floods back into focus. He is revived. Hold that image. The dripping rod, the brightened eyes. The honey brings life to the son's body, but it wakes a sleeping violence over the entire camp. To see how dangerous this moment really is, we have to look closely at the exact Hebrew word Saul used to bind his men. What kind of king weaponizes heaven against his own starving army? Listen to the king's voice in the early morning dirt. 1 Samuel 14:24. "Cursed be the man that eateth any food until evening, that I may be avenged on mine enemies." The King James says Saul adjured the people. He put them under a strict oath. But turn the English back into the Hebrew it was translated from, and the word sitting underneath is much heavier, much darker. The Hebrew word is alah. Read that again, alah. This is not a simple military command. It is not a standard battle vow. An alah is an imprecatory oath. It is a curse that carries a self-executing death penalty. In ancient Israel, an alah was a mechanism of divine execution. When a man invoked an alah, he was calling down the lethal judgment of heaven, wrapping it around an action, and setting it like an invisible snare over his own people. Look at how the Torah handles this. An alah is so dangerous that in Leviticus 5, simply hearing the voice of an alah and keeping silent makes a man bear iniquity. It binds the soul. It summons violence out of the unseen realm and drops it straight into the camp. Picture it. The men of Israel are standing before their king. They are hollow, starving, clutching their weapons. And Saul, the man anointed to protect them, unleashes a spiritual weapon directly into his own ranks. He ties his personal ego that I may be avenged on mine enemies to the wrath of God. I hold this as one reading, a study of the ancient language of vows, but the dread in the camp is undeniable. The men hear the alah. They are bound. The trap is set, hovering over the entire valley. If a single man breaks the fast, the curse will activate. It will demand a body. Now leave the camp. Step back into the silent, bleeding forest of Beth-aven. Jonathan is standing under the canopy of the trees. The text goes out of its way to tell us he is completely ignorant of the snare. He never stood under the shadow of his father's voice. But the curse does not care about ignorance. An alah is a blind hunter. It only knows if the wire has been tripped. Look at the object in Jonathan's hand, the wooden staff, the rod of a prince. 1 Samuel 14:27 tells us exactly what happens. But Jonathan heard not when his father charged the people with the oath. Wherefore he put forth the end of the rod that was in his hand, and dipped it in an honeycomb, and put his hand to his mouth, and his eyes were enlightened. Hold that image. The honey is on his tongue. The light rushes back into his eyes. The tip of the wooden staff is still dripping with the gold of the forest. But in the spiritual geography of Israel, Jonathan has just severed the wire. The alah has been breached. The king's curse is awake. The heavens over the camp are about to lock themselves shut, and the ancient stones of the high priest are going to start looking for a life to take. One drop of honey restored the sight of the sun, but a blinding darkness has just fallen over the father. What happens when the rest of the starving army watches the sun go down and the true cost of the king's vow breaks loose in the camp? Watch a starving man's face the moment sugar hits his blood. The pupils dilate, the fog clears, the tremor in the hands goes completely still. 1 Samuel 14:27 described this physical shift in the prince with 3 simple words. His eyes were enlightened. Jonathan stands in the woods of Beth-aven, wiping the raw honey from his mouth. A soldier beside him, trembling with hunger, breaks the silence. He tells the prince about the alah. He tells him about the curse Saul laid over the valley, the death sentence hanging over anyone who ate before evening. Look closely at how Jonathan responds. He does not panic. He does not drop the wooden staff. He looks at the exhausted, terrified soldier, and he delivers a devastating verdict on his own king. 1 Samuel 14:29. Then said Jonathan, "My father hath troubled the land. See, I pray you, how mine eyes have been enlightened, because I tasted a little of this honey." Stop right there. My father hath troubled the land. In English, troubled sounds like a mild inconvenience, a political misstep. But this is not English. Turn the word back into the Hebrew. The word Jonathan uses is akar. Read that again. Akar. This is not a word for making a bad tactical decision. In ancient Israel, akar is a terrifying legal and spiritual term. It means to bring a curse upon the camp by bringing something taboo inside the lines. It is the exact word used hundreds of years earlier in the book of Joshua, when a man named Achan stole forbidden treasure from Jericho. Achan's hidden sin brought a lethal snare over the entire Israelite army, causing them to be slaughtered in battle. Joshua looked at Achan and said, "Why hast thou troubled us, Achan?" The Lord brought disaster upon him in the valley of Achor. Same word, same weight. Jonathan is standing in the bleeding forest, holding the dripping rod, and he realizes exactly what his father has done. Saul's religious fasting vow was not holy. It was an akar. By weaponizing an alah, a curse against his own men, the king has turned the entire camp of Israel into a valley of disaster. Sit with the paradox. The king, trying to force God's hand through extreme religious deprivation, is entirely blind to the spiritual reality. The son, who just broke the religious vow by eating wild honey, is the only one who can actually see. The honey restored his physical sight, but it also sharpened his spiritual vision. He sees the snare. He sees the trap his father has laid over thousands of men. 1 Samuel 14:30 records Jonathan's grief. How much more, if haply the people had eaten freely today of the spoil of their enemies which they found, for had there not been now a much greater slaughter among the Philistines? He knows the men are running on fumes. He knows the curse has made them hollow. Picture it. The sun is sinking below the ridge. The shadows are stretching long across the valley of Ajalon. The deadline of Saul's vow is approaching. Cursed be the man that eateth any food until evening. Evening is here. The alah is about to expire. But the hunger of the men has been pushed past the breaking point of human endurance. Extreme, unbroken restriction does not create holiness, it creates a frenzy. When the sun finally drops, the army of Israel does not sit down to a lawful, quiet meal. The fasting decree of the king is about to trigger a mass violation of the oldest law in the Torah. What happens when thousands of starving, maddened soldiers finally lay their hands on the spoils of war in the dark? The sun finally drops below the ridge at Ajalon. The king's vow expires. But what breaks loose in the darkness is not a quiet, lawful meal. It is a frenzy. 1 Samuel 14:32 records the horror. And the people flew upon the spoil, and took sheep, and oxen, and calves, and slew them on the ground. And the people did eat them with the blood. Stop right there. Look closely at the verb the King James translators used. Flew upon. Turn that phrase back into the Hebrew. The word is ayet. It does not describe hungry men sitting down to a meal. It is a terrifying, violent word. It is the exact Hebrew term used for a bird of prey screaming out of the sky to tear into a carcass. The king's unnatural demand for fasting did not make his army holy. It turned them into scavengers. Picture it. Hours ago, the forest floor was sticky with the golden honey of Beth-aven, a provision heaven provided to revive them. They walked right past it. Now, the ground of the camp is slick with raw blood. By pushing human endurance past its breaking point, Saul's alah, his weaponized curse, has just forced thousands of men to violate a foundational law of the Torah. Leviticus 17 is clear. The life of the flesh is in the blood. No soul of you shall eat blood. To eat the blood is to drink the life source itself. It is a defilement that severs a man from the congregation. Saul hears the news. He panics. He calls his own men transgressors, entirely blind to the fact that his snare forced their hand. He orders a great stone to be rolled into the camp to drain the animals properly, and then he tries to cover the chaos with religion. 1 Samuel 14:35. And Saul built an altar unto the Lord. The same was the first altar that he built unto the Lord. Read that again. The first altar he built. A monument built in the dark, constructed in the middle of a blood-soaked camp to patch over the disaster his own ego created. The bleeding stops. The meat is finally cooked. The men eat. And the moment Saul's stomach is full, his ego flares up again. He looks at the exhausted men and says, "Let us go down after the Philistines by night, and spoil them until the morning light." The men, completely broken, say, "Do whatsoever seemeth good unto thee." But the priest steps in, Ahiah. He is wearing the ephod, the sacred garment of the high priest. He knows you do not. Move thousands of men into the dark without asking heaven first. Let us draw near hither unto God. See the scene. The altar is smoking. The priest stands before the king. He prepares to consult. The Urim and Thummim, the sacred stones kept in the breastpiece of judgment, the ancient mechanism by which the God of Israel answered the binary questions of kings. 1 Samuel 14:37. And Saul asked counsel of God, "Shall I go down after the Philistines? Wilt thou deliver them into the hand of Israel?" But he answered him not that day. Sit with that silence. He answered him not. The stones do not move. The lots do not fall. The Urim goes completely dark. Saul has built his altar. He has forced his men into submission. But heaven has locked its doors. The alah has triggered. The snare has snapped shut. Something in the camp has breached the spiritual boundary of Israel, and God will not advance the army one more inch until the breach is found. Saul knows the law. If heaven is silent, there is hidden sin in the camp, and he is about to use the sacred stones to hunt it down. But the English Bible is missing half of the terrifying prayer Saul prays next. What exact words did the king speak to force the silent stones to cut his army in half? A prayer lost for centuries until a shepherd boy threw a rock into a cave by the Dead Sea? Look closely at the chest of the high priest, standing next to the king's altar in the dark. Inside the folded linen pouch of his ephod sit two sacred objects, the Urim and the Thummim, the stones of judgment. When heaven refused to speak to Saul, he did not humble himself. He demanded an inquisition. He ordered the priest to activate the stones. 1 Samuel 14, 41 inches, the King James Version reads like a fractured sentence. Therefore Saul said unto the Lord God of Israel, "Give a perfect lot." And Saul and Jonathan were taken, but the people escaped. Stop right there. Give a perfect lot. What does that actually mean? The Hebrew text, preserved in our standard Bibles, the Masoretic text, is truncated here. The scribal transmission dropped a block of words. To understand the sheer terror of what Saul is doing, and exactly how these stones functioned, we have to look to the desert. We must open the Dead Sea Scrolls, sealed in jars in the caves of Qumran 2,000 years ago. Specifically, a scroll fragment known as 4Qsam-A. It preserves a much older, fuller version of this exact verse. I hold this as an historical window, a text that shows us exactly how ancient Israel understood this lethal ritual. In the Qumran scroll, Saul does not just say, "Give a perfect lot." He prays a terrifying, binding binary condition. He stands before the priest and says, "Lord God of Israel, why have you not answered your servant today? If this guilt is in me or in my son Jonathan, O Lord God of Israel, give Urim. But if this guilt is in your people Israel, give Thummim." Read that again. Saul is putting his own flesh and blood on one side of the scale and thousands of his men on the other. He is forcing the stones into a zero-sum game of death. How did the stones answer? The first-century historian Flavius Josephus writes in his Antiquities of the Jews that the stones on the high priest's breastpiece were not simply drawn from a bag like dice. He records that they would literally illuminate to signal God's presence or judgment, and go entirely dark to signal his withdrawal. Urim literally translates to lights. Thummim translates to perfections. Picture it. The camp is dead quiet. The air smells of charred meat and raw copper. Thousands of men who just violated the Torah by eating blood stand, waiting to see if the stones will condemn them. The high priest reaches into the pouch. If this guilt is in me or my son, give Urim. The Urim flashes. The lot is taken. The KJV says it plainly. And Saul and Jonathan were taken, but the people escaped. Sit with that. The army breathes out a collective, trembling sigh. They are cleared. The spiritual breach is not with the starving men who ate the blood in the dark. The stones have bypassed the obvious sin of the camp, and they have locked their crosshairs directly over the royal house. The alah, the curse Saul spoke into the morning air, has returned to roost. Saul and Jonathan step forward. They are completely isolated. But the stones have one more division to make. Saul demands the priest cast the lot a second time, to sever the father from the son. What happens when the sacred stones illuminate the prince holding a honey-stained staff? Picture the absolute isolation of the king. Thousands of armed men have just taken a collective step back, exhaling in the dark. The Urim has cleared the army. They are no longer the target. In the center of the blood-stained camp, lit only by the smoking stones of Saul's makeshift altar, stand the two men who started this war, the father and the son. 1 Samuel 14:42 gives us the command. And Saul said, "Cast lots between me and Jonathan my son." And Jonathan was taken. Stop right there. Look at the verb in the King James. Taken. In English, it sounds like a lottery draw. A random, passive selection from a hat. But turn the English back into the Hebrew, and the word is much sharper, much more violent. The word is lakad. Read that again. Lakad. This is not a word for picking a winner. It means to catch in a net, to snare by the throat, to capture by force. It is the exact word the Hebrew text uses when a wild animal is caught in a trap. It is the identical word used centuries earlier in the book of Joshua, when the hidden sin of Achan was hunted down, tribe by tribe, family by family, until the man who brought the curse was lakad, snared. The sacred stones of the high priest are not making a passive choice. They are springing a trap. The alah, the lethal, self-executing curse Saul breathed into the morning air, has been hunting through the camp all night. It ignored the thousands of men who violated Leviticus by eating the raw blood of the spoil. It bypassed the exhausted, trembling soldiers. It followed the scent of the wild honey of Beth-aven straight to the wooden staff, still resting in Jonathan's hand. See the scene. The priest stands between them. The Urim and Thummim sit heavy inside the linen pouch of the ephod. Saul does not hesitate. He does not ask heaven for mercy or clarification. He tells the priest to cast the lot a second time. He is perfectly willing to let the lethal weight of the alah fall on his own bloodline to vindicate his religious vow. The priest reaches in. The stones answer. The light flashes its terrifying judgment, and Jonathan was taken. Lakad. The prince does not run. He does not drop the dripping rod. He stands in the dark, his eyes still physically bright from the sugar of the forest, looking directly at a father who just weaponized heaven against him. Sit with that paradox. Jonathan knows exactly what he did. He tasted the honey. He broke the king's fast. But he also knows what his father did. The king spoke an lakad, a disaster over his own people. The stones have isolated the son, yes, but in doing so, they have completely exposed the father. By catching the only innocent man in the camp, the man who wasn't there to hear the curse, the very man who actually won the battle, the lots are forcing Saul to look at the absolute madness of his own ego. The stones have forced a horrific ultimatum. If Saul follows the ancient law of the alah, he has to execute his best warrior, his own heir, the man whose faith initiated the victory for Israel. The silence in the camp is deafening. Thousands of men are watching to see if a father will shed the blood of his son to protect his own pride. The snare is pulled perfectly tight. The stones have finished their work. But when Saul demands a confession from the center of the camp, what does a prince say to a king who just condemned him to death for tasting a drop of light? The smoke from the makeshift altar is blowing across the faces of thousands of silent men. In the center of the ring, the king looks at the son, the sacred stones just condemned. 1 Samuel 14:43. Then Saul said to Jonathan, "Tell me what thou hast done." Watch Jonathan's face. He is standing under a death sentence. The entire religious apparatus of Israel has just caught him in a snare. But he does not grovel. He does not ask for mercy. He lifts the wooden staff. 1 Samuel 14:43 continues, "And Jonathan told him, and said, I did but taste a little honey with the end of the rod that was in mine hand, and lo, I must die." Stop right there. Lo, I must die. He states it as a stark, absurd fact. He does not apologize for the honey. He simply acknowledges the mechanical reality of the alah. The snare has snapped. The law of the curse requires a body. Look closely at the object in his hand, the rod. In Hebrew, the word is padah. It is not a simple walking stick. A padah is a symbol of tribal authority, the exact word used for the rod of Moses that parted the sea and the rod of Aaron that budded in the tabernacle. Jonathan is holding the true authority of the kingdom, sticky with the wild provision of the forest, and he holds it out as the instrument of his crime. He waits for his father to act like a king. Saul does not blink. He does not rend his clothes in grief. He protects his ego. 1 Samuel 14:44. And Saul answered, God do so, and more also, for thou shalt surely die, Jonathan. Read that again. God do so and more also. Saul is weaponizing the name of God a second time to validate the disaster he created the first time. To save face before his starving, blood-stained army, he is perfectly willing to execute the only man who actually possessed the faith to start the battle. This is the terrifying endpoint of blind religious legalism. Go back just one book in your Bible. Judges chapter 11. A commander named Jephthah makes a rash vow to God to secure a military victory, promising to sacrifice whatever comes out of his house first. His daughter walks out the door. The father keeps the vow and sacrifices his own child. Same era, same dark theology. When a man worships his own vow more than the God he made it to, he will eventually shed innocent blood to protect it. Saul raises his hand. The decree is final. The Urim has condemned the prince, and the king has confirmed the sentence. The execution is imminent, but look out past the altar. Look at the thousands of men standing in the dark. These are the very men who just violated the Torah. They are the men who flew upon the spoil and ate the raw blood. By all legal rights, the wrath of heaven should have fallen on them, but the stones bypassed them. The stones isolated the prince. And as the exhausted soldiers look at Jonathan holding the dripping mate, something in the camp fractures. The spiritual authority of the king has just collided with the conscience of his army. A father has pronounced the death sentence over his son, but the men standing in the shadows have finally found their voice. A massive, unprecedented mutiny is about to rewrite the rules of ancient redemption. How does an army of lawbreakers overrule the stones of judgment to ransom the life of a prince? The thousands of men standing in the dark do not wait for the king's executioner to step forward. They move. A wave of exhausted, blood-stained soldiers steps between the altar and the prince. 1 Samuel 14:45. And the people said unto Saul, Shall Jonathan die, who hath wrought this great salvation in Israel? God forbid. As the Lord liveth, there shall not one hair of his head fall to the ground, for he hath wrought with God this day. So the people rescued Jonathan, that he died not. Stop right there. Look closely at that final sentence. The people rescued Jonathan. Turn the English back into the Hebrew. The word for rescued is padah. Read that again. Padah. This is not a simple military extraction. Padah is the exact legal and spiritual term for a ransom. It is the word used in Exodus for the redemption of a firstborn son. To padah someone means to pay the price of their life, to substitute one weight for another. The men of Israel look at the king's alah, the lethal curse hanging over Jonathan's head, and they overrule it with a superior spiritual force. Look at the terrifying paradox. Who is paying the ransom? The very men who just violated Leviticus. The men who flew upon the spoil like birds of prey and ate the raw blood in the dark. The formal religious structure of the camp caught the innocent son in a snare, but the broken, defiled army breaks the snare to set him free. I hold this as one reading of the ancient mechanics of the vow, not as the final word, but the shift in the text is absolute. Grace mutinies against legalism. The padah shatters the alah. Jonathan walks away from the altar. The execution is cancelled. The king is publicly stripped of his spiritual authority by his own men. But what happens to Saul? The text says he went up from following the Philistines. He goes home. And the Urim and Thummim, the sacred stones of light and perfection, go back into the linen pouch of the high priest. But heaven never answers King Saul through them again. The rest of his life is a descent into madness. The silence that fell over the camp that night becomes permanent, a locked door that will eventually drive him to seek a medium in the caves of Endor. The stones have spoken their final judgment on his house. The rest is just an echo. Go back now to the woods, where this story began. The forest of Beth-aven, the dust of the chariots, the hollowed-out army, the prince standing under the trees, holding the dripping wooden staff. You have read that scene 100 times as a simple story of a son making a mistake. But tonight, you know the anatomy of the curse hovering in the branches. The honey on the ground was never a test of obedience. It was heaven's literal provision for a dying army. The true danger was not the wood touching the prince's lips. The true danger was a king who weaponized his own ego and called it holiness. The honey brought light to the eyes. The religious vow brought a sword to the throat. If you stayed to the end, comment the word watched. Subscribe to the channel to keep these ancient texts open. And send this video to one person who loves the history of Israel's kings but has never heard what really happened in the forest of Beth-aven. Sometimes, the sweetest provision on earth only looks like a death sentence because you are listening to the wrong voice in the dark.